Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another lecture. Today, I want to talk about social relationships. Pretty key chapter in our study of adult psychology, and at the key and foundation of social relationships would be attachment theory. Uh, Attachment theory is a theory which looks at our early childhood relationships with primary caregivers, usually parents, and particularly for most of us, our mother. And on the basis of that early relationship, certain dynamics are set up, certain emotional connections between the infant and the caregiver. And these patterns of interaction set up our expectation as to how to interact with people. And clearly, there's variations on the study of attachment style, but secure attachment would be the kind of attachment that, thankfully, for the majority of us, approximately 65% of kids have this. And as we go into adulthood, this pattern of attachment means that we have a relatively good sense of trust of other people and attunement. In other words, just a sense of being able to read and feel secure in other people's interactions with us. This leads to, generally speaking, better ability to communicate and a cooperative and kind of flexible way of behaving with most of our adult relationships. Now, with regard to non-secure attachments, the theory talks about avoidant and ambivalent and disorganized. This would be the attachment styles looking at our early years. Avoidant attachment would be a kind of learning style or relational style in which, generally speaking, we avoid entanglement, emotional entanglement with others as much as we can. Children with an avoidant attachment style have learned to see their childhood relationship with their caregiver as not very reliable, and the idea here is that if I avoid interactions, I don't have to suffer the disappointment of my expectations not being manifested. And clearly, avoidant attachment style in adulthood can be, as you can see in front of you, can manifest itself as dismissive or fearful. Both of these are essentially ways of bringing our childhood relationships into adulthood. And there is, can we put it, difficulty in connecting with people. These are adults who fear connection because connection begins to result in emotional entanglement. And so the idea here with the avoidant is just avoid connection or limit it or minimize it. And this way you won't have to be negatively and adversely affected. Ambivalent attachment would be a childhood relationship with a caregiver in which there is not a kind of dependability on this relationship in adulthood, that the person sometimes is connected, but sometimes is distant and sometimes is hostile. So the kind of anxious adult attachment style, this is a person that's always over monitoring how other people are relating to them, perhaps being very, very sensitive to uh, criticism, being sensitive to small breaches in the relationship. We can summarize just generally that attachment theory does posit that our childhood attachments will affect our adult attachments all through the life. And again, attachment theory isn't completely negative. We can learn to mitigate and understand our attachment style and figure that out in adulthood. But the research shows that pretty much our way of interacting with our primary caregivers is replicated and in our adult relationships. So think of the importance of early childhood experience for the rest of our relationships. Now, a couple of just general comments. One of the things that research has found is that as we get older, the number of social relationships that we have gradually diminishes. So if you want to look at in front of you in the blue line would simply say that as we go from, say, age 10 into our 20s, that we increase the number of social relationships we have. And then clearly there's a slow decline as we go through life in the number of interactions, social relationships we have. Now, when we look at this in a little more detail, you can see that the solid black line in front of you, this would be our family networks of social relationships, and that tends to stay stable over time. Family is family is family, whether we're 10 or 30 or 90. And so those social relationships tend to decrease. And you can see that other personal networks and friend networks. So personal networks would be, these are people that we know at church, people that we know at work, people that we know through other people, and let's say our friends. Those, you can see those lines basically go down over time, and there's good reasons for that. For instance, in terms of personal networks, we are going to lose some of those as we age, in terms of moving, in terms of retiring from work or leaving our jobs, in terms of being less involved with social activities. And so the upshot of this figure is that over time, our family slowly becomes a greater percentage of our social relationships, and that's kind of significant for navigating our social relationships as we age. Now, perhaps the most important, or one of the most important social relationships that we will have going into adulthood would be what we might just call euphemistically as our intimate partnerships. Marriage would be probably the largest example of this, but that more and more people are choosing not to get married. They're choosing to cohabit. They're choosing to live together or live apart. But it's not just marriage. And indeed, when we think of intimate partnerships, most of us tend to think of, maybe the 20s and maybe even early 30s these days as the key time in which we're seeking out intimate relationships. Again, we want to just talk about a few things here. This mate selection idea is something that all of us, one way or another, navigate, who we're attracted to, and attraction has quite a lot of elements to it. There is the lust aspect, or the physical. We are sexual beings, and clearly our sex drive waxes and wanes over the lifespan, mostly wanes. But what psychologists refer to as the lust system of mate selection is just speaking to the desire most of us have, however we act or do not act on that, however we define and see that. Our moral worldview comes in, but it's undeniable that we are sexual creatures and are drawn to others. And but attraction isn't just about lust. It's certainly about exchange theory, that our intimate relationships that we establish often have a basis in which, I scratch your back and you scratch mine. We look for people in which there is a fit. And let's face it, all of our approaches to finding someone significant in our life to spend our life with, whether marriage or otherwise, is drastically affected by our social context and our environment. And the huge change over the last 10, 15 years is the advent of clearly dating sites, if I could put that in quote, internet dating sites, and Bumble and Tumblr and uh, uh, Our Time and Match.com and all of these kind of things, the research shows that more and more people find their significant other online, and indeed that's a whole dynamic which has drastically changed things. Um, as we mentioned earlier, people still want to get married, and not everybody does. And cohabitation clearly is a greater and greater percentage of these significant relationships. And you don't need this class or your textbook or anything to tell you that there's obviously a greater and greater cultural acceptance of cohabitation. Even the terminology of living in sin as opposed to cohabitation speaks to the kind of change in moral understanding of that. The reality, though, is that cohabitation has higher rates of failure. It has higher rates of dissolution and separation. There is something about the legal and religious understanding of marriage, which the research does show that people tend to put more effort into keeping the relationship because let's face it, when you're married as opposed to living together, when the relationship starts to get rocky, that marriage does tend to be a glue which clearly doesn't result in people staying married. Divorce rates are high, but certainly the effort that you would put in to try and fix a marriage relationship as opposed to, where you're living with someone and hey, this didn't work out, you move out, I'll move out, and we'll just go on our happy ways. So that clearly has changed over time. The families that you and I are a part of, clearly there are all kinds of different family configurations, and the family structure that we grew up in, whether it was two parents, with three siblings, or whether your grandparents lived with you, there was an extended family, or there was a blended family, to a parent and a step parent, and children entered into. So the various types of family structure are going to clearly shape our understanding of family. As we get older, culture is very, very important aspect in that. But when we look at social relationships, clearly our relationships with our children or with our parents are quite interesting to think about, and the research is quite interesting. That you would expect that these relationships change over time. I know, I'm a father and a divorced father, and so I came from a certain kind of family background. When I was a kid, my parents are still alive, and I had three siblings and two parents, and again, I fully expected that when I got married, I had two kids. I still have two kids. That was going to stay the same, but divorce changed a lot of that. And my relationship with my kids is relatively close. I pretty much text them regularly, and there's a lot of interaction. But clearly, as a parent to adult children, my role and their role, social role with me, has changed. I am more of a, not quite a friend, but more of an advisor, more of uh, um, I guess it's a kind of friendship, which I'm very grateful for, but it's certainly not the kind of friend that my children would have in terms of people the same age as them. Um, but that attachment is changed. I know I've had enough opportunity to recognize that when my two kids, a boy and a girl, are going through hard times, there tends to be a lot more interaction because, for better or for worse, they tend to look at me as a stabilizing force, or as a force of advice, or as a force of just listening to them when they are struggling with this, that, and the other thing, relationships or jobs or whatever it is. So that the changes in attachment clearly occur as we age. Um, you can see here the effects of late life divorce. Much has been written about parents getting divorced and the effect on their children when they are of school age or younger. But the research also finds that even parents that get divorced and they have adult children, that there are dynamics that cause relative conflict. Think about it, and some of you may experience this. You have to interact with both of your parents, but your parents their interaction is fraught with, in some cases, conflict, in other cases, not so much. And so, you got to navigate that. Where do you spend Christmas? Um, how do you deal with your parents? And indeed, some parents spend quite a lot of their emotional energy in dealing with children that haven't done very well in life, even adult children. I certainly know people that their children are in rehab, or their children have moved back home because of, including grandchildren, and so these myriad possible ways in which these social relationships change as we get into older life are evident today. I don't have any grandchildren, but I certainly have friends about my age that have grandchildren, and so grandparent-grandchild relationships run the gamut of heavy involvement. My parents weren't around much because they lived overseas and lived in North Carolina when my children were young, so the relationship between my kids and their grandparents is relatively minor. Um, but I have a brother who has three children, and um, he lived very, very close to my parents, and so his children are very close to my parents, and that relationship is a significant one. In addition, his wife passed away when my niece and nephews were younger, and so my grandparents stepped in and took care of them and watched them. So that's a very, very strong relationship. We can point out that generally speaking, grandchildren tend to have closer relationships with their mother's parents, in other words, their grandparents on their mother's side, than on their fathers, and that shouldn't surprise us, simply because women in general, tend to facilitate closer relationships with family members over time, and so that would go a second generation. We can point out that obviously when there's a family crisis of some sort, sometimes relationships tend to get tighter. Again, if I could use a personal example for my brother, whose wife passed away in her 40s of cancer, and so that family crisis, becoming a single parent with kids, caused well, can I put it, a significant change in our family dynamics. I am much more involved in my niece and nephew's life, his children, than say my other brother and sister's kids. And my grandparents jumped in, my parents jumped in to be caretakers for their grandchildren. So family crises of all kinds, job loss and divorce, and change the dynamics of grandchild relationships. And I know, speaking with my parents, they are very, very grateful for the strong connection they have with some of their grandchildren, and they see that as their primary ministry in these last 5 or 6 years in their 80s, that they speak into and act into their some of their grandchildren's lives. One of the things, interesting dynamics or social relationships that changes over time, is our relationship with our siblings, our brothers and sisters. Again, those of you listening to me, think about your brothers or sisters or stepbrothers or sisters, and think about the numerous ways those relationships emerge. But those, for many of us, tend to be very, very key social relationships as we age, depending upon your family and where people live, and the level of commitment to getting together. So there can be emotional distance here. If I could speak about my mother's relationship, she has four siblings, but her parents were missionaries in Central African Republic, and once they hit high school, they went off to these boarding schools, and so their relationships with each other have been very minimal. I have an uncle that I've never actually met. They're all over the world, and so there are cousins that I've never met. So it can be very emotionally distant, depending upon all kinds of things. Other relationships, sibling relationships, clearly are some of the closest we have. I again have two brothers and a sister, and my relationship with my sister over the years has been a very, very close one. And therefore, the relationship between our kids has been very close because there's been significant interaction. And they get together. Again, a number of them live out in California, and so they'll get together for Thanksgiving or they'll get together for a weekend. So it's a certainly a closer relationship. But you can imagine that the dynamics of these sibling relationships as we age, depending upon the nature of them, can be hugely important or relatively minimal. All of us have friends, and our friendship networks change over time. I don't know about your friends, but some of us make friends when we're in school, and those friends become lifelong friends. And indeed, we stay friends. I have a very close friend with uh, a gentleman named John, and he's a professor at Wheaton College, and we, again, are in our 60s, and we have stayed friends over our entire lifespan. I met him when I was in my 20s, and he was in his 20s, and we've stayed connected. There were big gaps. There was about a gap of 20 years. But I visit him several times a year, and he visits me several times a year, and it's one of my most important relationships. I do have to say that I haven't kept up with most of my friends from childhood or even high school or college. Most of my friends tend to be ones that I work with or I go to church with. But friendship networks among women in general tend to be more stable over time. It's a interesting gender difference that women do tend to put energy into keeping long-term friendships, and so those are much more likely to be long-term relationships. But friendship networks can become huge aspects of our social network, and indeed for me, I have several very, very good friends, long-term friendships, and I'm very grateful for them. Um, we have to say too that depending upon what you think of pets, for many people, particularly people as we age, the pets we have become more and more significant as significant social relationships. And again, some people might laugh at that, but pets become hugely beneficial for some people as they age in dealing with loneliness or connection. And I mean, let's face it, some Americans treat their pets better than they treat themselves, and between the way they teach their children. Americans and people around the world spend, billions of dollars a year ensuring that their pets are taken care of. I was listening recently to a research study which found that people are much more likely to, when they're given a prescription by their doctor as opposed to their vet, much more likely to fill the prescription for their animals and make sure that the prescription is taken correctly than they do for themselves. So pets are hugely important in terms of those relationships. We do have to, and I will have a conversation about um, the rise of social media in terms of friends. Facebook, of course, being perhaps the longest one and the one in which most people are consistently involved in it. And some people obviously spend quite a lot of time on Facebook interacting, talking, sharing. In my whole family, I'm the only one not on Facebook. I just don't like social media. And so my parents, particularly my mother, who is a Facebook, she's on Facebook all the time, is always saying to me that it's easy to communicate with everybody except for me because I'm not on Facebook. But social support is really huge. Social media obviously has its strengths and weaknesses, but it becomes hugely important for some people as they're isolated, maybe in terms of moving away, for ongoing social support, for connection, for interaction. And again, our Facebook friends or whatever other Instagram or TikTok or whatever other social media people use, it becomes significant for us in terms of our social relationships. And indeed, when when the research looks at people in their 20s as opposed to people older, the network of social relationships online becomes proportionally higher. Now, that's not true for everybody. Again, as with my mother, who is very active on Facebook with all kinds of different people, that becomes a huge way of socializing for her. But there are other older people clearly that have never gotten on social media, and that would be minimal for them. So there are all kinds of factors that affect this. But when we think of social relationships, we will have to, and the research will show as we go forward, that social interaction online has become a much greater element in our social relationships. Thanks for listening. This is just a kind of quick overview, and you'll certainly have a lot more opportunity to look at the details of this as you read your textbook and look at the other materials online. Thank you.